In this first video of Cornerstone 1 of Cor Unum, we want to ask some questions about fundamental theology. In particular, what is fundamental theology and what does it study? We want to do this because the first cornerstone of Cor Unum really has two central but interrelated components, and that is fundamental theology, which we'll look at in this video, and then also biblical foundations. And the two, you'll see, really are interrelated because they both have to do with how God has revealed himself to us. Both the fundamental theology piece and biblical foundations are going to study God's self-manifestation to humanity and how we understand that. So we want to ask the question, what is fundamental theology? Because even people with a certain amount of familiarity with theology might not have heard the term fundamental theology. So what does it study? Fundamental theology is that branch of theology that studies systematically the foundations of Catholic faith. That is the fundamental elements, the foundations that the rest of theology, that the rest of our Catholic faith is built upon. So that means things like revelation, that God has revealed himself to us. If you think about it, the rest of theology is going to assume that God has revealed himself to us. Well, fundamental theology reflects on that mystery of God's self-manifestation. It's also going to study the response to that revelation, which is our response of faith. So these are really two of the core elements. A lot of the rest of these elements flow from these two. So if God has revealed himself, we'd also study something like the transmission of revelation through scripture and tradition. That is, if God has revealed himself to us, and that culminated in the person of Jesus Christ, well then how does that revelation get to us 2,000 years later, both in its purity and its totality? So you'd look at the modes of passing that on in scripture and tradition. And then you'd talk more about those two things like the nature of sacred tradition and how is it related to scripture. You'd look at the inspiration of scripture, its truthfulness. You'd have to ask questions about the interpretation of scripture. You'd also look at the task of the magisterium, or the teaching office of the church, and how that teaching office of the church has a particular role in the transmission of revelation. In particular, it has the charism of infallibility. You'd also look at themes related to faith, things like the harmony of faith and reason and the relationship of the two. And you'd look at the human person. You'd look at the conditions of human experience which allow individuals to be open to receive revelation. So you can see all of these elements point back to God's revelation and our response of faith. So we could say even more succinctly that the object of fundamental theology, what it studies, is the self-manifestation and self-giving of God in Jesus Christ. That is, revelation. And then the credibility of that self-manifestation. So revelation and its credibility. So actually the exact content of fundamental theology as a unique discipline is sometimes divergent or disputed among different authors. What exactly should be studied in fundamental theology? But always, the core is the study of God's revelation and its credibility. The other unique thing about fundamental theology is that fundamental theology studies revelation in a systematic and global way. It studies revelation in its kind of totality. When we get to other disciplines within dogmatic or systematic theology, or other branches within dogmatic or systematic theology, they break this reality or this mystery down into particular mysteries and study these one by one. So for instance, you'll have there might be a class on Trinity where you'd study that particular aspect of what God has revealed, that he's one and three. You might have a class on Christology, who is the person and what is the mission of Christ. Soteriology, you'd study the mystery of salvation. Mariology, you'd study the person of Mary and her relation to these mysteries. Well, fundamental theology, rather than breaking these mysteries down into particular mysteries and studying them one by one, Fundamental theology considers this mystery of God's revelation as a whole. It asks the question, what is God's revelation and why is it credible to believe in it? So fundamental theology also reflects on the conditions that make the experience of faith possible. So God has revealed himself, but what allows the human person to place their faith in God, right? So Cardinal Avery Dulles has said that the assignment of fundamental theology is to show how the decision to become a Christian can be a responsible exercise of human freedom. So how is it that we recognize that God has revealed himself in this particular way and then use our intellect and will to make a responsible exercise of freedom in making the act of faith? That's that element of credibility. It also responds to the why of the event of faith in Revelation. Why would one place faith in what God has revealed? And this responds to what Peter said in 1 Peter 3:15, where the apostle invites us always to be ready to supply our reasons to other people who question us about the hope that's in us. So again, we're seeing fundamental theology addresses revelation and the credibility of that revelation, so the human person is able to make the act of faith in that revelation. So we could also ask, to whom is fundamental theology addressed? And the simple answer is fundamental theology is addressed to our contemporaries. But that means, first of all, the believer, because the believer is always the first person to whom theological thought is directed. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about theology in general, but theology assumes revelation, that God has revealed himself, and that we've placed our faith in that revelation. So it's there is a bit of a insider baseball kind of thing with theology. It assumes that we're within a believing community, that we've placed our faith in revelation. So fundamental theology is addressed to the believer. But fundamental theology also, in a particular way, is addressed to the unbeliever, those who don't share our faith, because they have this, they're particularly in view of the work of fundamental theology. Because again, fundamental theology is asking, why is revelation credible? Why is the act of faith in what God has revealed, why does that make sense? Why is it a responsible exercise of our intellect and will, a responsible exercise of our freedom? So we could say really that fundamental theology has a listener in our entire culture today, whether believer or not, because the listener is anyone who has a strong need for meaning, right? For meaning. The need for meaning is all the more urgent today because people are more and more aware of it, and because everything around them is dragging them towards the absurd, towards lack of meaning, towards the idea that this is all an accident. So it's to them, to our contemporaries, to believer and non-believer, who fundamental theology in a new idiom needs to address, that the church needs to address, to bring the Trinitarian love of God that reaches its highest point in the Paschal mystery of Jesus Christ. That is to say, if our contemporaries are in search of meaning, that the Catholic faith has an answer to that meaning. Fundamental theology asks those basic foundational questions about making a response to that God has revealed himself to be a Trinity of love. God has revealed himself in the person of Christ. That God has revealed himself in the person of Christ as one who wants to bring us into communion with him, but also that this revelation is credible, that we can make an assent of faith that is reasonable and is an exercise, a responsible exercise of our human intellect and will, of our freedom. So in our next video, we'll move on just a little bit to talk about the history of fundamental theology. How did fundamental theology arise as a particular discipline within theology?